Hi, I'm Leo and welcome to my YouTube channel Scold Me. In this CSS animation series, we're going to start with the CSS transform. Now, basically here we'll be discussing how to move an element from one point to another, and we're going to start with the translate function. Now, this video is actually for beginners, so if you're good with CSS animation, there's no point watching this video. Alright guys, at the end of the video, if you think the tutorial was helpful, please hit the like button, and if you have anything to say about any part of the video, just leave a comment, and if you're new, please consider subscribing for more updates. Alright, translation is the movement of an element from where it would normally appear to some other place, and in order to do that we use the Cartesian coordinate system, which is your XYZ system. Now the Cartesian coordinate system is a way of describing the position of an element or an object in space using either 2D, which would be your X and Y axis, or 3D, which would be your X, Y, and Z axis. Now in CSS3 we use the X axis to place elements on the horizontal plane, while we use the Y axis to place elements on the vertical plane, and the Z axis for depth. Now I have a picture here, and I'm going to be moving this picture about to show you how the translate function works. Now here in my code, I'm going to put the code in the description so you can actually play with these things. Now my HTML file, you can see I have just a picture, and in my CSS file I'm going to put the translate function. Now to do that, I'll write translate. Now the translate function, you can see we have 5 types. We have the translate X, translate Y, translate Z, translate, which is like the 2D translate, and translate 3D. Now I'm going to start with the translate X. Now notice that the X here is a capital letter, so when you change it to a small letter, it's not going to work. Now for the translate function, it takes just 2 units, which is length and percentage. Now your length could be pixel, rem, or m. Now if you don't know the difference between pixel, rem, and m, you can check out my video on CSS units for responsive design. So here I'm going to put something like 200 pixel, and when I save and go back to my browser, you'll notice that the picture is going to move 200 pixel towards the positive x-axis, which would be the right hand side. Now I have actually added some transitions to my code because I want this movement to be slow so you can see how it works. Now when I put a negative value here and save, you will notice that it's going to move in the opposite direction, which would be my left hand side. You can see that. Now but there's something very funny about the translate Y. Now I can also put percentage here, and it's going to move. Now you can see it's even moved further. Now there's something funny about the translate Y. Now that's because when you put a positive number, it goes downward, but when you put a negative number, it goes upward. Now notice that when I save and go back and reload, the picture is going to move downward even for a positive number. But when I go back and change the value to a negative one and save, you would see that it's going to move upward. So please take note of that when you're doing your translates. Now next up is the translates, now which would be like the 2D type. Now here all you do is you put your first value, which would be for the x-axis, then you put your comma, and then you put your second value, and that will be for the y-axis. So when I go back and reload, you'll notice this picture is going to move this way, which is x and y axis. You can see it goes that way. Now when I change this to a negative number, it's going to move upward to my top right hand side. Now you can see that. Now next up is the translate 3D. Now to use the translate 3D, you have to put three units in the box. Now whenever you put 2 units, this is not going to work. Let's say I put 200 pixel. When I save and go back to my browser and reload, you would notice that this picture is not going to move. That's because the translate function takes three values. So let's say I put just 0 pixel and save. When I go back, you will notice that the translate function, translate 3D, is going to work. Now you can also have your translateZ, but when I do that, nothing changes because my web page is more or less a 2D space. So you can see when I save and go back and reload, you would notice that nothing really happens. That's because my web page is more like a 2D space. Alright, this translate function, I've discussed the various types of translate function, and I told you that it takes values of length or percentage. Now the Z transform takes only length, it does not take percentage value. And I also told you that for you to use the 3D, the translate 3D, you have to put in 3 units. Alright, next up we're going to move to the scale function. Alright, the scale transform or function makes an element appear larger or smaller depending on what value you use. Now, in order to use the scale function, there are 2 things to have in mind. One is that it takes real number, that's only positive numbers, and secondly is that the numbers don't carry any units. So when I go back to my code here and type scale, now the scale function is similar to the translate function. You can see I have scale X, scale Y, scale Z, scale, which is more like the 2D scale, and also scale 3D. Now we're going to start with the scale X. Now when I put 1 here and save, when I go back, you'll notice that nothing really happens. Now this is because 1 is more like saying same size, but when I go back and put any value other than 1, you're going to notice the change. Now let me put something like 3, which means I'm saying this image should be stretched out in the x-axis 3 times the normal size. Now you can see it stretches out. Now when I go back and change the value to something much smaller like 0.5, you will also notice that it's going to kind of shrink in the x-axis only. Now when I reload and hover, notice that it shrinks. Now same happens for the translate Y. Now when I change this to Y and save, when I go back, you'll notice that it's going to shrink in the y-axis. Now notice that it shrinks in the y-axis, and when I put a larger number, let's say 4, you're going to notice that it's going to stretch out in the y-axis. So that's how the translate X and translate Y work. Now next up, I am going to move to the translate. Now the translate is more like the 2D. Now here you can put 2 values separated by a comma. Let's say I go with 3, 2. Now the first value is for the x-axis and the second one is for the y-axis. Now when I save and go back, you notice that it's going to stretch out both in the x and y-axis. Now notice it's going to stretch out both in the x and the y-axis. Now last but not least is the scale 3D. Now the scale 3D, just like the translate function, takes 3 units. Now for example, when I save this and go back, you will notice that nothing happens. That because the scale 3D has to have 3 units. It could be the same, it could be different, whatever, but it must be 3. Now when I put even a 0 here and save, when I go back, you'll notice that it's going to work, although it's going to work more like the scale 3D. Now that's because my web page is more like a 2D space, and so you cannot really see the effect of the third axis. Now next up, we are going to move to the rotation function. Now for the scale function, note that I told you that it takes real numbers, and those numbers, they are unitless, and by real numbers I mean only positive numbers. Alright, next we'll go to the rotation function. Alright, the rotation function causes an element to be rotated around an axis or around an arbitrary vector in 3D space. So now the rotation function takes about 4 different units. It takes the degree, which would be deg, the gradient, which is grad, the rad, and the ton. But the most commonly used unit is the deg or degree. So I'm going to go to my code here. Now the rotate function is also similar to the translate and scale function. So I'm going to start with the rotateX. Now when I put something like 60 deg, when I save and go back to my browser, you'll notice it's going to rotate in the x-axis. You can see it moves. It's almost like it's shrinking, but it's actually rotating. Now when I put a much larger value like 110 or 1100 deg and save, when I go back and reload, you'll notice it's going to actually rotate. Now watch what happens when I hover. You can see it actually rotates. Same goes for the rotate Y. Now when I save and go back to my browser and reload, you'll notice that it's also going to rotate in the Y axis. Now that's that for the rotate X and Y, and for your 2D you just put a rotate. Now for the 3D takes a different syntax. Now the 3D is more like you put your scale and then you put the degree 45 deg. Now when I save, what I'm saying is rotate 45 degrees to the X, Y, and Z axis. Now when I go back and reload, you'll notice it's going to rotate both in the X and Y axis. Now most times this is what I use in place of rotate 2D. So when I change this value to 2, it means I am saying rotate 2 times 45, which would be 90 degrees in the Y direction. So when I save and reload, you'll notice that it's going to rotate like that for the Y axis. Alright, that's that for the rotate function. Next we're going to move to the skew function. Alright, for the skew function, when you skew an element, you slant it along either to the x-axis or the y-axis. Now there is no z-axis for the skew function, and there is nothing like 3D skewing. So I'm going to go to my code now and I'm going to show you how this works. Now when I come here and put skew, you can see it's skew x, and skew y. When I put, let's say, skew s, now the skew takes the value of angle, and the most common one is the degrees, which is deg. So when I put let's say 45 deg here and save, when I go back to my browser and reload, you'll notice the object is going to be slanted 45 degrees. You can see that. Now when I change it to something like 75 degrees, you're going to see it's going to be slanted even more. Now you can see when I reload, notice it's going to be slanted even more. Now same happens for the scale Y, sorry, skew y. So when I save and go back, you notice it's going to be slanted towards the y axis. Now when I do that, you see it's slanted towards the y axis. Now you can also do your skew, which would be for your 2D. So let's say I put skew there and I put 45 comma 45. Now when I save and go back to my browser and reload, you'll notice that it's going to skew both in the x and y axis. You see, it's almost like it's it has disappeared. Alright, that's that for the skew function. Now next up we'll go to moving the origin. Now basically all I've done so far, you'll notice that the origin is the center, that's the default. So in moving the origin, we can actually change the default origin of our transform. So next up is moving the origin. Now the moving the origin function takes values of left, center, right, top, bottom, etc. Now here you can also use your length, something like 20 pixel or 20 or 20 rem. So now I'm going to put now in order to use that, you're going to put transform origin. Now before I add this, when I go back, you'll notice that it's going to be rotated towards the on the middle, that's the center. Now when I go back, I can actually change this to right, and when I save, notice there's going to be a little change in how this was how it was displayed before. Now when I save and reload, notice it's a bit different. Now I can also change it to left and save. When I go back, you notice it's also going to be different. You can see that. Now I can also put bottom here, and when I save, notice it's also going to be different. Now this is the bottom function. You can see how it moved. Now I can also do something like top. Now we also have top. So when I put top here and save, when I go back, notice it's going to move differently. So now this is you can see it's different. This is the various or different ways of changing your origin. Alright guys, I'm kind of tired now, so we're going to start with the transition in my next video. Thanks for watching, and